Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the séance. Welcome to the 7th Dead Woman Poets UK tour event. I will let you know before we start that we're recording the event, so you are welcome to have your cameras on, but if you don't want to appear in anyone's gallery view or in the recording, you might want to turn your cameras off. I am Jasmine. I will be your medium for this evening's séance. Before I talk about Dead Woman Poets and our guest poets tonight, I'm going to start by, as we start all of our séance events, by reading a poem by Marina Tsvetaeva, a Russian poet. I'm just sharing my screen. We shall not escape hell. We shall not escape hell, my passionate sisters. We shall drink black resins. We who sang our praises to the Lord, even the finest, with every one of our sinews, even the finest. We did not lean over cradles or spinning wheels at night, and now we are carried off by an unsteady boat under the skirts of a sleeveless cloak. We dressed every morning in fine Chinese silk, and we would sing our paradisal songs at the fire of the robbers' camp. Slovenly needlewomen, all our sewing came apart. Dancers, players upon pipes, we have been the queens of the whole world, first scarcely covered by rags, then with constellations in our hair, in gale and at feasts, we have bartered away heaven. In starry nights, in the apple orchards of paradise, gentle girls, my beloved sisters, we shall certainly find ourselves in hell. And so, with that fiery proclamation, I'll begin the séance by introducing our first guest poet for the evening, which is Geneviève L. Walsh. Jen is poet, spoken word artist, creative writing mentor, and loud-mouthed queer feminist. Yay, our favourite kind of person. They have released 2 books with Flapjack Press, The Dance of 1,000 Losers and Vitriol Works. Walsh is the founder of Halfiax's Spoken Weird and a compere with the Mancunian intersectional feminist collective Stirred Poetry. They were the first non-male poet to be published by a northern touring troupe, A Firm of Poets, and remained a core member until the group's swan song in 2017. They are currently the resident poetry tutor with Stand Up Sisters Bolton. They are resurrecting the American beat poet Diane di Prima tonight. So I should also say, on a personal note, Jen was my first poetry mentor as a teenager. So it's particularly exciting to be hosting Jen tonight. And yeah, Jen is going to resurrect Diane di Prima, who I know absolutely nothing about. So I'm really excited for this. And yeah, over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Jasmine. I quite like being described as an event. I really like that. Is Jen a woman? No. Jen's an event. Yes, so today I'm going to be resurrecting the feminist, activist, Buddhist, rabble-rousing beat poet Diane di Prima. She'd probably think it was too soon to resurrect her, as she only passed away last year. She'd be like, Jen, I'm 87 years old, let me have a rest. But if there is anything that I have learned from Diane di Prima's poetry, it's the notion that the best poets often cause a lot of inconvenience. So I will refer you to my, oh, this is seamless, this. I will refer you to my PowerPoint. There we are. And yes, there we go. So yes, Diane di Prima, 1934 to 2020. So for a little background, Diane di Prima was born in 1934 in Brooklyn, New York. After 2 years at college, she moved to Greenwich Village at the heart of the beat movement, where she gained friendships and personal professional alliances with the prominent beat poets, some of whom were Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and Denise Levertov. More on her later. So the beat movement, to give a very, very, very potted history of it, was essentially born out of the ashes of World War II. And the poets within this movement were exploring the landscape that everyone had been left with. They questioned everything that pre and mid-war West had become complacent about and comfortable with. So politics, culture, sexuality, religion, class, or just the day-to-day attitude of everyone who had lived through that tumultuous time. They were explicit, forthright and raw in their subject matter, and their approach to form was one that stepped on the conventional approaches to rhyme and meter in favour of a stream of consciousness approach. Now, in terms of her published work, di Prima released her first collection, This Kind of Bird Flies Backward, which you should be able to see the front cover of, in 1958. She published her own work and the work of her contemporaries in both the Poets Press and The Floating Bear, which she co-ran with Amiri Baraka. And before her death last year, she released an enormous 40 collections. This séance is going to explore a few elements of her work which will haunt us in the best way possible for quite some time. And those things are non-conformity, intertextuality, wildness, and the complexity of both poems and the human body. So let's start with the rather broad term non-conformist. Di Prima was born into a world war and grew up in the aftershock when the terms and conditions of being an American, a woman, a worker, a mother, a lover, and a friend, and a writer were undergoing gargantuan changes. Her revolutionary letters, which you should be able to see the cover of there, which she began writing at the tail end of the 60s, were concerned heavily with social and political changes that the post-World War II world was experiencing. This is one of those poems, and it's a revolutionary letter number 4. Left to themselves, people grow their hair. Left to themselves, they take off their shoes. Left to themselves, they make love, sleep easily, share blankets, dope and children. They are not lazy or afraid. They plant seeds, they smile, they speak to one another. The word coming into its own, touch of love on the brain, the ear. We return with the sea, the tides. We return as often as leaves, as numerous as grass, gentle, insistent. We remember the way. Our babes toddle barefoot through the cities of the universe. And that was from 1971. So this is my COVID era reboot of the poem, and it's about as cheerful as you're expecting it to be. The last 18 months have seen people, I'd say, fetishizing the war that that Di Prima was born into, while, you know, simultaneously basically being very taken aback by the fact that they could not go for a pint, get a haircut, or go to the beach for a day. This is called Reverse Evolution number 1, and it includes some strong language from the very first line. We were left to ourselves and we fucked it up. Our follicles screamed, don't touch, put the rusty blunt scissors and the vodka down, back off. And we clicked ignore. Shoes, dope, sex and sleep, we stared at them on TV with dribbling raw nostalgia. We were Pavlov's hounds of hate, scratching marks on our walls in comfy prisons. We were left to ourselves and forgot how to love. We screamed instead for sea, for grass, for the fall of leaves and the speech that on reflection wasn't all it was cracked up to be. We were left to ourselves and self became paramount. We were left to ourselves and the world turned right. We were left to ourselves and now the babes born into lockdown train themselves to smile at strangers toddle through a universe of spite. Thank you. So while the human race seems to be taking a turn for the worse, how can those of us with compassion and empathy attempt to make things better? One way, and I'm sure it's a way that Di Prima would agree with, is to put one of intersectional feminism's main ideals into practice and to make space for those who need it. So I'm going to start this part with a disclaimer because when I talk about gender, I am going to use a word that Di Prima never would have used herself because she was from Brooklyn rather than Brighouse, and that word is bloke. Now, that word does not apply to men in general. It applies to a specific type of man, cisgender, white, and utterly convinced that the world belongs to him. We've all worked with him. We've all gone to school with him, been stuck with him in some situation, and we have definitely all met him at a poetry night. Now, the beat movement, like a depressing amount of poetry movements, have been very bloke heavy. To this day, you'll meet people who carry their love of Ginsberg and Kerouac around with them like it's the insulin that they need to keep their creativity alive. Di Prima was someone focused on making space for people who weren't blokes. So women, be they trans or cis, non-binary, gender fluid, agender people, and especially those of us who dance somewhat awkwardly on the area of queerness. The Poets Press, which she operated in the mid to late 60s, and the literary journal, The Floating Bear, which I mentioned previously, they were just two examples of when she used her status as a white cis woman to draw attention to other LGBT writers. Danielle Demain eloquently referred to this as a form of queer family making, which is something I think we'd like to see more of within various poetry communities. It's one of the reasons I approach my own publisher, Flapjack Press. It's why I joined the Stirred Collective over in Manchester. So personally, I find Diane di Prima's ethos very commendable and very relatable. When it came to carving her own niche in a predominantly blokey world, Diane di Prima didn't make sweeping statements within her work. She attacked the history of patriarchal ideas from within. She was tearing them apart and rewriting them. She responded to the most familiar religious bloke tale, if you will, of Adam and Eve, wherein Eve deprives Adam of his all-access pass to paradise, line by line from the Gospel of Eve. This segment of said Gospel appears just before the poems. I am thou and thou art I, and where thou art I am. And in all things I am dispersed, and from wherever thou willst, thou gatherest me, but in gathering me, thou gatherest thyself. So that's from, that appears before those poems in the book Loba, but it's originally from one of the lost Gospels, the Gospel of Eve. So each poem in this 5-part poem is based on one of those lines. I will just read you 2 rather than all 5 of them. And where thou art, I am, astride the wind or held by 2 hoodlums under a starting truck, crocheting in the attic, striding forever out of the heart of quartz, immense, unhesitant, monotonous as galaxies or rain or lost cities of dinosaurs now sunk in the unopening rock. Who keeps the bats from flying in your window? Who rolls the words you drop back into seed? Who picks sorrows like lice from your heart and cracks them between her teeth? Who else blows down your chimney with the moon, scattering ashes from your dismal hearth to show the sleeping bird in the coals? Or is it garnet you lost? What laughter spins you around in the windy streets? And in all things I am dispersed, gold fleece on the hunted deer, the name of everything, sweet poison, eternally churned from the milky ocean, futurity's mirror, ivory gate of death, The fruit I hold out spins the Dharma wheel. I weep, dry water I am, cold fire, hour, materia, mother and matrix, eternally in labour. The crescent I stand on rocks like a shaky boat. It is the winking eye of God. These poems are an example of something di Prima was an absolute expert in, which is using intertextuality to rip literature apart and explore all new meanings. And that's something she does a lot of in Loba, which I would definitely recommend getting. It's an absolute masterpiece. She was a feminist with an astute knowledge of worldwide faiths and spiritualities, and this was how she filled in the gaps and expanded on them within this familiar story. I, however, am far from an expert on religion. I am just your average godless goth, and I have never left room for Jesus when I dance. But I am also a feminist and an atheist who has grown to find, how should I put this, atheists of the bloke variety very, very tiresome. So my exercise in feminist intertextuality has taken almost exactly the opposite route and is based on a nauseating article by the late Christopher Hitchens entitled "Why Women Aren't Funny." This is a brief part of it where he describes using humour to make yourself appear attractive. If you can stimulate her to laughter, I'm talking about that real, out loud, head back, mouth open to expose the full horseshoe of lovely teeth, involuntary, full and deep-throated mirth. Well, then you have at least caused her to loosen up and change her expression. I shall not elaborate further. My response to this is called Loba and the Punchline. Real, out loud, head back, mouth open. I plunge into my guts to halt the twist of the rusty screw that is the thought of my cub running agape into a trap like you. Let her howl in Schadenfreude's arms, not strain her lungs to rasp at the walls in a cage made of your expectations. Let her jaw remain so tightly shut that no keeper can unlock them. No space for a pound shop treat or a sleeping pill. The full horseshoe of lovely teeth. No cheesy good luck symbols will be found in my feral firstborn's mouth, just rough snow peaks and shards of broken pottery, left bare from falls from tree houses, from rugby scrums, from life. Her mouth will be a single magpie sat under a ladder, teeth that taste of shattered mirrors. Involuntary, full and deep-throated. Every sound from my little wolf's lungs will come with conviction. She will feign interest in domestication, volunteer her gums for inspection, a sophisticated ruse no longer than an 80s jingle. Bite, just one. And she could make a meal of you, but she'll leave you instead for the crows. Thank you. So, reading di Prima's poems aloud is a strange experience because, broadly speaking, of how she wrote them and how they appeared on the page, it took a great deal of practice for me to work out how to make them spring off the page from my unavoidably British mouth. It's always a jarring experience, generally speaking, reading somebody else's poems, as you immediately bounce off their use of line breaks, punctuation and white space, and hers was completely different to mine and sometimes completely and utterly off the wall. Now, when it comes to the structure of poems, and there's a very fantastic, I love this quote, it's from a lady I've previously mentioned called Denise Levertov, and she said that every space and comma is a living part of the poem and has its function, just as every muscle and pore of the body has its function. And the way the lines are broken is a functioning part of a poem's life. Now, going with this as a guide, I can only conclude that di Prima's perception of the human body is one standing in a hall of mirrors, basically. And this is one of di Prima's poems where I think this interpretation seems very apparent. The window. You are my bread, and the hairline noise of my bones. You are almost the sea. You are not stone or molten sound. I think you have no hands. This kind of bird flies backward, and this love breaks on a window pane where no light talks. This is not time for crossing tongues. The sand here never shifts. I think tomorrow turned you with his toe, and you will shine and shine, unspent and underground. That was taken from her first collection. So the final poem that I have written in response to Di Prima's work, and specifically to that poem, is based on an anecdote in an obituary written about her last year by the writer Amber Tamblyn, who had been a close friend of hers for many years, who said that Di Prima used to give her slips of paper on the way out whenever she visited her at home in the last few years of her life, and she would refer to these little slips of paper with bits of poems on them as feathers, which I found just really, really touching. It's worth noting as well that Tamblyn was one of the founders of the Time's Up movement, and she says in the same article that Di Prima played a key part in her development as a feminist. So this poem is about bodies, it's about harassment, and it's about poetry. Featherless birds. We shed feathers in the street, in the office, in the bar, on the train. Lines of verse drop away to the dirt. Leave tarmac, hot, dry skin and writer's block. We quench with nicotine, trash TV and gin. Feathers iridescent in their turn of phrase, feathers full of lurid rage, feathers all the colours of the bleeding country, feathers blacker than the meaning of black, plucked and never given back, feathers limp away in a dupe stink wind down the motorway, unheard, unseen, feathers meet their end on the buffed windscreens of death machines, feathers smack on the dress shoes of the pigs who gorge on decency. This kind of bird learns how to fly with stealth, with trepidation, with blind spots and shadows as their "you are here" marks on maps, with minimal stops to rest our wings. This kind of bird eats mistrusts, drinks from a bath of deprecation, flies to the page and the stage where we can spread our feathers wide, hover with precision over vehicles of matricide and shit on their windscreens in broad daylight. And with that really charming image, I would like to thank you for listening. Ms. Di Prima, you may now have a well-earned rest. I've been Geneviève Walsh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was absolutely magical. I think you've changed for me forever now the image of birds shitting on cars, which is really special, and the idea of so moving on from Di Prima, I'm going to do a little bit of a quick plug for some Dead Woman Poets things. So if you are enjoying yourself and think you would like to see more of this kind of thing, we have our final Arts Council tour event in Leeds. Maybe in Leeds, maybe not in Leeds. It may be in person in Leeds, or it may be online. So we're yet to announce that, but you can keep an eye out on our website for that. That would be on the 26th of August. We also, if you are attending from somewhere which is not Leeds and you want to come to another online event, we have an event as part of Wayward Festival in Scotland, which will be online on the evening of that's on the evening of the 26th, sorry. Leeds is the 23rd. Helen's links that she's posting in the chat will be correct, so don't trust anything I say. And also, if you're interested in coming to one of our zine making events where we resurrect the dead woman poets through the medium of zine making, you can attend the Wayward zine making event that we are running online. And I will just post a little link in the chat, which is a link to a video of the last zine workshop we did, the last public workshop, which was in person. But I promise you it will be just as exciting as magical on Zoom. It will be different, but we also have some merch on our site if you want a fabulous Dead Woman Poet Society tote bag if you don't have one already. And our resistance zine, compiled by Lily Arnold, we compiled through open submission, and this was a fundraiser for Sisters Uncut, so all of the profit that we make from this goes to Sisters Uncut. You can buy that on our site. And lastly, the issue of Modern Poetry and Translation that we guest edited, Origins of the Fire Emoji, which contains contemporary translations of poems by dead women poets. You can no longer buy on our site because we've nearly run out, but if you're booking a ticket to the Leeds event, you can get it there. I've done plugging things now. Back onto the thing you came here for. So I am very excited to announce Charlotte Wetton as our next guest poet. Charlotte Wetton is based in West Yorkshire. This is our West Yorkshire night. Her first pamphlet, I Refuse to Turn into a Hat Stand, won the Michael Marks Award 2017. Her poems have been published in Poetry Wales, Staple, Stand, and won a New Writing North Award in 2019. She has performed at Albury and Ledbury festivals, came second in the Stanza Slam, and has a spoken word album, Body Politic. Her poetry reviews are published in Modern Poetry and Translation, the Manchester Review. She completed her MA in Creative Writing with distinction at the University of Manchester. She is currently a PhD candidate in Creative Writing, researching the work site in contemporary and 18th century poetry, where she learned about the dead woman poet she is resurrecting, Ellen Taylor. I've never heard of Ellen Taylor either. They're getting rarer and rarer in these events. I love it. Yeah, so I'll hand over to, you've had your dose of fantastic blue hair for the night, and now I'll hand over to the pink-haired Charlotte.
Thank you, Jazz, that lovely introduction, and that's fab. Yes, and I'm a poet and PhD candidate, and I discovered Ellen Taylor early in my first year of my PhD. I'm just coming to the end of the first year. So I didn't know about her when I was writing the proposal for the PhD, and I found this one poem in one anthology of hers, and it really blew me away. So that's the poem I'm going to focus on tonight. We don't know very much about her at all. There's almost no critical work written about her. And everything we do know about her comes from basically from the poems themselves, should we choose to read them autobiographically, and from the introduction to that collection. So hopefully you can see this is the front cover of this little book of poems. Obviously it's out of print. It was published in 1792 in Dublin, and the introduction was written by a gentleman. We don't know who he was. So everything we know about Ellen is filtered through this kind of upper class male who writes about her. And the poems were actually published without her permission or even knowledge, which doesn't sound great to modern ears, but was intended as a kindly gesture at the time. So it was intended as a fundraiser for Ellen. She was a very poor woman. She worked as a servant. She was a cottager. So they published the poems by subscription, which is basically the 18th century version of crowdfunding. And when you get a bunch of people to say, yes, I'll give a shilling or whatever, and then you have a long list of dedications in the front of the book. And the kind of double pointer is to get as many lords and ladies in that list as you can to impress all your friends. So it was published in this crowdfunded way, intended as a fundraiser for her, as getting the maximum amount of money for her. So we know that she was very poor, that she suffered several bereavements, notably the death of her brother, which really affected her. And she was then forced to look for wage labour for paid work instead of working in the home, and she became a servant. Let me see if I can. I'm sorry. So I don't have a picture of her. So I've put together basically a random selection of paintings of working class women of the late 18th century. And these do come with a health warning because, of course, when paintings are very expensive. So when someone is painting a working class woman in this period, they are painting them in order to sell the painting to a rich person. So you immediately have this kind of like skewed looking going on with these paintings. So I wouldn't trust these paintings, but these are essentially the closest that we have to Ellen Taylor because we don't know what she looked like, how she would have dressed. The lady in the middle with the iron, I think is perhaps actually a lady's maid who is perhaps ironing her mistress's clothing. She's wearing pale clothing, which would have been very difficult to keep clean. She's got quite frilly sleeves. If you look, these sleeves look quite impractical. A ribboned headdress. She looks altogether very serene, quite a low cut dress. If you look at the lady on the right, the older lady with the white apron and spoon, we do know that this lady, whose name is Elizabeth Ticknell, one of the few named women, has a much more practical garb, so I would kind of trust that one more. So this is kind of an attempt for me to show you what Ellen might have dressed like during this period, the kind of tasks she might have undertaken, and I will come back to the laundry later. We also know, again, from this introduction, not written by her, that she was from Queen's County, as it was then called. You can see this map on the side. This is a contemporary map from the 1770s. So it's what's now County Laois. It's about 100 kilometres southwest of Dublin. You can see how depopulated it was. And the other map is a map of Dublin at the time, so obviously much smaller. And all along the river that runs through the city, there would have been these big, lovely houses going up in this period, owned by the Anglo-Irish. So Ireland had been colonised since about the Elizabethan period, land taken from predominantly Catholic Irish people, local lords, and systematically kind of the usual bought, tricked, traded, killed their way through, and so by this period the Anglo-Irish were completely established as the with their social, political and civil rights as the wealth holders of Ireland. They held all the cards, and Catholics and dissenters were denied kind of basic political and civil rights. And then I've put these dates on this slide, so just look at what was going on at the time that Ellen was writing. You've got the American Revolution, where they cede from the colony, cede from Britain with their war. You've got liberty, fraternity, equality in the French Revolution, and these same ideas around self-representation, self-determination and equality also bubble up in the Irish Rebellion of 1798, 5 years after Ellen publishes her collection. So it's a really sort of divided society, a really kind of hierarchical, strictured society, but there is huge resistance to that. The Irish Rebellion was put down in quite a bloody fashion. There were atrocities on both sides. It was an unsuccessful rebellion, and by 1800, England and the Anglo-Irish aristocracy have again really wrested control of the Irish political system again. So that's the kind of thing that's going on during the period that Ellen is writing. And although her work is not overtly political, I feel that there are little tremulous kind of little roots that feed through into how she views the world and her place in it, as we shall see. I'm not going to read this poem because it's quite long, and I'll run over, but I have put this in as a little teaser for you. It's an occasional verse. Occasional poetry doesn't mean poetry that you write occasionally, as I thought until recently. I mean, it means verse that you write for an occasion. So someone invites you to tea and you write them a thank you to inviting them to tea, or they celebrate the birth of your son or something. So this poem is addressed to a gentleman who had lent her some books. And I've put this poem in because during this period there was a real fashion of vogue for peasant poets, for people like Stephen Duck, who was sort of adopted by Queen Caroline in London. And they were thought to be sort of like mushrooms springing up from the ground, this natural genius. I think that's really lent us to see these poets as uneducated, and I think that's the wrong word. I think we should call them self-educated. And this poem, I think, just really speaks to that. You'll see here we've got reference to Milton. On the other page we've got Thompson, that's James Thompson, who wrote The Seasons, a hugely influential poem, and Edward Young, the proto-romantic poet. So this is a whole poem in which Ellen basically celebrates her reading in her library, and other working class women poets of the period do exactly the same thing. So in fact, every poet I'm looking at for my PhD has a poem, at least one poem in her collection, where she riffs off a poet like Pope, or she kind of does her own version of a Bible story, or rewrites something from The Spectator, or kind of praises Milton or in some way. So there's a lot of riffing off, kind of emulating styles of their reading. They're very open about their reading and their influences. So I've just put this one in as a taster, so that if you read about other working class women poets like Anne Yearsley or Mary Leaper, you can have in the back of your mind, not uneducated, self-educated, because we've got the textual evidence to support that from these poems themselves. Okay, I will read this next poem and talk about this one in a bit more detail, because it is a really funny, intriguing poem, I think. It's called Written on Miss Porter During a Lingering Illness, and I'll read it straight through. I now once more invoke the sacred muse, though I must own she long has dormant lain, yet hope at present she will not refuse me to assist in this my plaintive strain. Beneath yon spire in the adjacent vale, there stands a lonely, hospitable seat, where art and nature try who'll most prevail to render each embellishment complete. The shorn hedgerows mantled o'er with green, the shady limes in nicest order placed, the beech and elm increase the rural scene, and all around proclaim the owner's taste. There once I lived, and though in servile state, my situation was to me no pain, nor did I then regret my sordid state, for in that house I could not feel the chain. My mistress, ever tender, good and kind, I there received her mild commands each day, nor did it once disturb my peace of mind, with utmost cheerfulness her to obey. An only daughter did the mansion grace, whose sympathizing soul and feeling heart to all around diffused naught but peace, nor could she bear to see another smart. But too soon does lingering sickness come, and by degrees consumes her tender prime, for why the lady in her youth and bloom, like frost-knit blossoms, dropped before her time. So this appears to be quite a sweet, sad poem, very favourable towards her employer, very sympathetic towards this lovely woman. But I think there's something quite odd going on in this poem, which I can only, well, firstly, I just don't think it's about Miss Porter. So it's called Written on Miss Porter During a Lingering Illness. So the first word of the poem is I. That's not I, Miss Porter, that's I, Ellen Taylor. This is a poem about Ellen Taylor. Okay. She starts, I now once more invoke the sacred muse that I must own long has dormant lain. So the whole of the first verse is about Ellen's intellectual struggle, her own writing, her own creative force. It's a 7-verse poem, and 1/7 of it is about Ellen's relationship with the muse. So she immediately opens the poem, sets herself up as a writer, an intellectual, even perhaps one with a classical education, although she goes on to say she's a servant. So she's invoking herself as quite a powerful player within this poem. The next verse, the second verse, beneath yon spire in the adjacent vale, beneath the church in the next valley. This is not about Miss Porter either. This is about Miss Porter's house. And the whole of the next verse is about Miss Porter's house. So we're now 3 verses through and we've still not mentioned Miss Porter. And these 2 verses I find really fascinating. So remember I said about when we looked at the map of Dublin, the Anglo-Irish building these lovely big houses. During this period, people are mad for garden redesign, for improving their farmland, improving their estates, for building new houses, mostly with wealth that we nicked from people overseas, some legitimate trade as well. We've got early industrialization. So all of this money is going into improving the land and showing off this relationship with the land. So Ellen is really tapping into this, and she goes into some detail about it. So the shorn hedgerows mantled o'er with green, the shady limes in nicest order placed, and all around proclaim the owner's taste. And again, taste in this period is really important because the society is changing. They've got industrialization, people moving to cities, fear of crime. You no longer know your neighbours and their parents' parents. So manners and taste become more important ways of negotiating society and showing your place in the social order. And by using this in this poem in this way, I think that Ellen is in fact claiming that for herself. So although these are Miss Porter's possessions, these limes and elm walks, Ellen is demonstrating that she knows the why they are being done in this way. She is seeing the relationship between the man-made and the improvement of nature. So she's actually demonstrating her own taste and her own awareness of these fashionable improvements. And then we get to the crux of it, the fourth verse. There once I lived, and though in servile state, my situation was to me no pain, nor did I then regret my sordid fate. Sordid was less of a negative word. It just means more like lowly or humble in this period. For in that house, I could not feel the chain. And I need to find a more literary academic phrase for this, but basically this is my pink elephant theory of this poem. If I say to you, whatever you do, don't think of a pink elephant, you're all thinking of pink elephants, right? You can't stop thinking about that pink elephant. You can't not. And this is kind of what's happening in this poem. It's like she's having an argument with a silent interlocutor, with the reader. No, it didn't cause me any pain. No, I didn't regret my sordid fate. No, I didn't feel the chain. It's like this constant rebuttal against the silence of the reader. So in kind of protesting too much about this, I think she's really highlighting, okay, maybe I didn't feel the pain because my employer is so wonderful and sweet, but you could. She's clearly introduced that idea into the poem. Okay, I'm getting short of time, so I'll move on. But I think this is just kind of these social and political swirling eddies of American Revolution, the Irish Rebellion. I think these are coming through in the way that Ellen writes about her social state during this period. I mentioned laundry. Let's get back to laundry. Okay, so the next poem is called Written on the Barrow's Side, where she was sent to wash linen. And I want you to think for a moment about what it would be like washing laundry in a river. If you've ever dropped a bath towel into the bath and picked it up again, you'll know how heavy it is. If you've got a wet load of laundry out of the washing machine, you'll know how heavy it is. That's been spun dry. You haven't lifted it out of the river. Look at this woman's brawny arms. This is a trope of the period. This woman on the right, this is actually a Dutch drawing. Look at those brawny forearms and those massive hands, because she's so muscular, because she works so hard. You'll see this in a lot of paintings working class women in the period. Here's some more. So this lady is standing in the river. Imagine how long it will take you to hand wash a load of laundry, and you'll be standing in wet, cold water and mud during that period, not just your hands. And here's some laundry drying up on the right, it's kind of on a fence. So let's look at this poem, thinking about these red chapped hands and this heavy laundry, and we'll see what Ellen has to say about laundry. And this is the poem that has inspired my response. Written by the barrow's side, where she was sent to wash linen. Thy banks, O Barrow, sure must be the muse's choicest haunt. Else why so pleasing thus to me? Else why my soul enchant? To view thy dimpled surface here, fond fancy bids me stay, but servitude with brow austere commands me straight away. Were these virtues in thy stream, how freely would I drink, that not so much as on the name of books I e'er might think. I can but from them learn to know what's misery complete, and feel more sensibly each blow dealt by relentless fate. In them I oft have pleasure found, but now it's all quite fled. With fluttering heart I lay me down, and rise with aching head. For such a turn ill suits the sphere of life in which I move, and rather does a load of care than any comfort prove. Thrice happy she condemned to move beneath the servile weight, whose thoughts ne'er saw 1 inch above the standard of her fate. But far more happy is the soul who feels the pleasing sense, and can indulge without control each thought that flows from thence. Since naught of these my portion is, but the reverse of each, that I shall taste but little bliss, experience doth me teach. Could cold insensibility through my whole frame take place, sure then from grief I might be free. Yes, then I'd hope for peace. So you've been rather badly set up for a poem about laundry here, because it's clearly a poem about a woman's intellectual and artistic freedom being crushed under the weight of servitude. So she starts off the poem again with the muses, and she's looking at a natural, beautiful environment, but she's seeing it through the eyes of a writer. This is her work site, this is her work environment. She's been sent to wash linen, and she twists that around and she takes that work site off her employer and she says, no, this is my artistic playground. And the way I see this river, this dimpled surface, fond fancy bids me stay. It's so pleasing, my soul is enchanted. She's claiming her right to that space as a writer and an artist, and her relationship with the muse is preeminent. She goes on, where Leith virtue in my stream, how freely would I drink. So the river Leith is the river of forgetfulness. So when people go down into Hades in the underworld, they drink it and forget everything. So again, she's pointing this kind of classical learning that she's managed to acquire from somewhere. And she says, not so much as on the name of books I might think. So she then goes on to say how books have, although given her much pleasure, actually, they've shown her more sensibly each blow that fate gives her. So because she's more educated, she's read more, she's more in tune with her head and her heart, actually, she, by learning more, by knowing more, it's made her more sensible of her lot in life and more about the burden she carries. And then she does an interesting thing in this middle verse, with fluttering heart I lay me down and rise with aching head, which, as in the previous poem with her appreciating the line walks, she kind of recasts herself as this fragile upper class woman. This is more like Pamela in Samuel Richardson, who swoons every time someone tries to seduce her. With fluttering heart, I feel like the word swoon is hovering around this paragraph. So she's kind of really claiming that space as a feeling person. She's not just a workhorse, she's not just a servant, someone to be ordered around. She feels things as passionately as Pamela, for example, in Richardson's novel. For such a turn ill suits the sphere of life in which I move. So she's really honest about this. She's saying for such a turn, as in her temperament, her personality, ill suits the sphere of life in which I move. And she then goes on to kind of set up these sort of prototype women. And it's interesting that she uses women. So in using kind of an abstract noun, kind of as she does with servitude in the second verse, she doesn't sort of talk about, you might think that the ideal artist of the period might be a young man, kind of free to go on the European tour without the encumbrances of a wife and child. She uses women in this, which I think is quite interesting, that it's as though she's throwing her personality and she's thinking about these alternative lives, these alternative people she could have been, which is still gendered. So thrice happy she, condemned to move beneath the servile weight, whose thoughts ne'er saw 1 inch above the standard of her fate. So she's got this idea of this happy servant woman who never aspires to read a book or to write a poem, if only she could be that person. But even more happy is the soul who feels a pleasing sense and can indulge without control. And underneath this poem is this kind of almost hidden metaphor of the river that comes through in the language. So the thoughts are without control, they flow, there's a pleasing sense. The language in this verse at the bottom and under number 9 really echoes the language in the first and second verse when she talks about the dimpled surface, fond fancy. It's this very light river, which is contrasted to the servitude that commands her straight away. So you've got these straight lines of servitude and then this flowing, organic, kind of feminine river that kind of runs through the poem. But she knows that naught of these my portion is. So she knows that, I'm neither of these prototype women. I'm the reverse. I've got the worst of both worlds here. And then she does an interesting thing where she sort of throws her authority and she says that I shall taste but little bliss, experience doth me teach. So she's saying, this is not some theory that I'm setting up. I know this because experience has told me this. So this is her right to say her truth in this verse. And then she does this amazing, beautiful, calm ending to the poem, could cold insensibility through my whole frame take place. And it's kind of got a quasi-Christian kind of sacrificial Lamb of God kind of, the poem ends on the word peace. And it's a beautiful, slow ending to a poem which is in fact incredibly depressing and incredibly brave, that she is how honest she is in her situation, that she can't do anything about this servitude and her thwarted ambition. And it appears from the introduction that this was in fact true. So there's quite a funny bit in the introduction, and then I'll get on to my poem. So very quickly, the chap writing the introduction says that she offered herself as a servant in a gentleman's family near where she lived, and continued in that situation for some time, always behaving with great propriety and good conduct. Very important that all women writers must be proper and have good conduct. This is something you see in all the introductions of the period. Yes, she was also virtuous as well as a writer. But her affliction of her brother's death and a melancholy turn of mind occasioned by her many and different distresses rendered her unfit for a service where activity and labour were actually necessary. She was therefore dismissed, but for no particular fault or misconduct. So this is like, yeah, there was no such thing as confidentiality. And as I said, this is like someone's HR record just in the introduction of their book. It's fascinating, isn't it? So it seems that this poem, I'm reading these poems very autobiographically, and partly why I'm doing this is because they so closely mirror the introduction written by this person. Okay, so I'm going to read my poem now, and then I will stop. So this was inspired by the last poem. The river Leith Barrow colder. Could cold insensibility through my whole frame take place? I perform an experiment for Ellen Taylor with my left foot. Sitting on a convenient rock in the sunshine, I submerse my foot in the river colder and wait. The cold lips of the water round my calf, clutching a bearable discomfort. I notice 2 bricks at the bottom of the river. I notice tansy and green elconet. Now, strangely, my skin feels warmer, wearing a boot of stone. I hear ducklings in the reeds. It's not the skin that's cold, but inside. The red and white strands and planes, abstractions invisible inside the red hidden heat of me. Not pain, slower and softer than pain, filling my mind circling back to this near dead somnambulant foot. The urge to pluck it out is strong, skin tingly, yet the muscles inside reluctant to move, even to flex, solidified, struck numb. Ellen is right. I can think of nothing else. Drawing back into myself, wholly present in my own foot, hard to thought flow, stuck. I yank my foot out and touch it. Cold as metal, like someone else's robot foot. Under the water, the paved stones of the weir, dug out, cut, loads hauled, heaved, burdens worked in cold mud and water, dug and sunk, levered, jammed into place, packed down, mast heft, hammered, sunk in base river mud. No inscriptions, just rows of set stones, green slime, serving still, pressed under a weight of water. Ellen, can you not slip under the surface, your whole frame, fit the angle of your shoulder against this squarish rock, this niche braced, linen unfurling through the water? It is possible to breathe with only your nose and mouth above water. If you align yourself to the current, your thighs like 2 logs washed down in the peat-tainted water, pebble spine swaying fluid. Is it not possible to enjoy a river from underneath? Ellen, whose thoughts are like wagtails, dip down off again, in flash scatterings and foam specks, in burbling rills and runlets, gurgling rucklings downstream, ripple dimple in the river, shimmy round rocks, silver fish quick flip and twirl away twigs. Gnats change tack every new idea. Zip, zip, skim, doodling a dance on the light glance, glint, glitter, flicker of the peat-rich river. Tiny brown boat of a sycamore leaf, furled and crisp, carries away Ellen with her river-weed hair. Else why my soul enchant? Dirty linen basket forgotten on the bank. 2 logs rushed down by the current, sodden stubbed trunks, forced over the weir, rammed against the bank, bend or break. Ceaseless, dulcet violence. Tansy and green elconet on the banks, stilling, stiffening, slower and softer than pain. Ducklings in the reeds, endure, subdued blood gelid. Choose the river rolling your skull to a small round pebble, benumbed, stone sunk body settling into silt. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I think we'll just, are we changing the screen back? Thank you. That was magical. What a find. You know, like we've had so many women poets resurrected now, many of whom were invisible for various social cultural reasons, but I don't think we've ever had a peasant poet. I think that's a first, and that's really special. Thank you, huge thank you to both Jen and Charlotte. I feel like I should, for context, say that I think we asked them to do this gig more than 2 years ago. And then it took us a while to get the Arts Council funding, and then COVID happened, and here we are more than 2 years later. Many things have happened, but you've stuck with your dead woman poets and had all that time with them, and it's really come through, so thank you.